So, Josh, think of this as a thought experiment. But what happens if enough OPEC countries get together and say, listen, we are going to accept settlement and repayment in something else besides a dollar denominated unit of account? That's not to say we're going to completely abandon the dollar or do something else. Rather, it is to say we might, let's say, have a target of settling numbers on my backside here, 3%. And something else besides a dollar, just to, and this is the way you would this is how the diplomats would phrase it, just to expand our options, see how systems work out, do a test drive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I started thinking about this, and I think about this in the context, particularly after coming through the banking crisis we had here in the States about, 2 months ago now, with SVB and a few others blowing up, mainly due to bond yields rising and the banks suffering or theoretically suffering a mark-to-market loss on the bond portfolio they had to liquidate early. And here are my thoughts in no particular order on this. I think back to Brent Johnson, as he repeatedly says, and I believe he's correct to say this, is that countries, sovereigns might say many things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can actually get it done. There's a good quote in geopolitics, I'll put up on the screen right here, which is that preferences are optional and subject to constraints, whereas constraints are neither optional nor subject to preferences. And I think about that in the context that if you have these other countries, or these other sovereigns, I should say, that might say, sure, we don't necessarily like the idea of having the dollar there, but then again, we also even more dislike all the other alternatives. So, what are we supposed to do? And hence you kind of get into this chicken and the egg type thing. Well, it was there, we'd use it, but the reason we're not going to use it is because it's not there. And if we try to build it, it's ridiculous because no one is using it because it's not there, right? So, how do you kind of start the thing, or how do you create, the genesis that creates the network effect, or, pull yourself up by your shoestrings, pick whatever silly way you want to describe it. Anyways, as a thought experiment going on, I don't know how foreign centrals and sovereigns would think of treasuries, but this is the best way that I've got so far, is that I would think of them as like a gift card. So Josh, you get a gift card for your birthday or whatever. Let's say you have two flavors of gift cards. One of them is like a gift card to, I don't know, pick your favorite store, Best Buy or whatever, right? And you can only use it at Best Buy or the Best Buy family, or to some restaurant chain. You can only use it at any of the restaurants that are actually within that chain. The other type, so that would be like a closed-ended gift card. The other type of gift card you can get would be an open-ended gift card. That's like getting like a Visa gift card or an Amex or a MasterCard or whatever, right? You can pretty much use that anywhere that a Visa, MasterCard, or Amex is accepted. And when I think about treasuries from the perspective of a sovereign, that's the best way I can wrap my mind around it. Again, I'm not saying it's a good way of doing it, nor is it entirely accurate, but I think it helps me, frame this particularly well. This gets into the network effect of the US dollar. Because of your gift card, that is, if your US treasuries accepted, pretty much everywhere and by anyone that you can do, why wouldn't you want that? Or why would you be compelled to dump it in favor of something else, particularly if it's going to constrain where you can use that or where you can redeem it for goods and services in the future? And so I did some more thinking about this, and just like you had the banks that ran into trouble when they became essentially forced sellers of their bonds in order to raise liquidity to deal with deposits that were leaving the financial institutions, I guess, maintain the ratios. I also wondered if there's anything that could force a sovereign to liquidate or dump their treasuries early. And I think to myself, well, what can actually compel a sovereign to do anything? And I don't have a good answer for that, save maybe another sovereign or, some sort of, geopolitical catastrophe, or some maybe like great environmental disaster, like some, earthquake generates a tsunami or whatever, God forbid there's some horrible environmental disaster that's going to necessitate loads upon loads of rebuilding, and it will compel the sovereign to act in order to raise cash. But the reason I mention all of this is that we are coming in, when we record this, supposedly when the TGA is going to start being refilled in the coming weeks. This would suggest that there would be a crunch on liquidity, although perhaps not to the extent that people seem to think that there is. But nonetheless, if you're going to see interest rates go up, that also means if you're holding bonds and their bonds are not going to mature anytime soon, the bonds are probably underwater. Now, again, if you're a sovereign, why don't you just sit in the bonds indefinitely? I mean, what would force you to sell? And this kind of brings me back to my point with OPEC, in that, and this is maybe a geopolitical question as well, which I don't know the answer to, is what could exist that would force a sovereign, or that would want to make a sovereign liquidate treasuries early, even if it's at a discount, and even if they have to take a loss on it. And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but my ignorance and not being able to articulate an answer doesn't necessarily mean that something doesn't exist on that front. So anyway, I just want to throw that over to you and see if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, the main point that you were going over is what happens to the treasury market and to the dollar if OPEC decides to settle in other things besides the dollar. And I think everyone right now, there's a huge de-dollarization fan page going on that is kind of saying, well, of course, the BRICS, well, look at what the US did to Russian sanctions. That is a huge huge headwind for the
Mm-hmm.
dollar. That's I mean, how we can't trust the dollar anymore? What if that happens to us? We need to start to diversify into other assets. And many people are thinking, well, it makes sense that OPEC is going to start to settle with China, Russia, India, the BRICS nations, kind of what everyone has been
Yeah.
talking about. And I think that we are heading toward that trend. And I also think we've been heading for that trend for the past 20, 40, 50 years. That is a very, very long process. Do I think it's going to happen overnight? If OPEC tomorrow says we are going to release, or we will take any currency for oil, just give us whatever. If I was going to make a bet on that market, it would still be predominantly dollars.
Yeah.
Why? Because of the network effect, what Justin was just saying. If I pay every single week for my oil in dollars and I'm used to it, I already have my dollar denominated debt. I already have my assets coming in dollars. I already have the treasuries. Why would I want to change that flow of things? You would need a gigantic shift to occur for you to be incentivized to change your entire business model from using dollars to using a different currency. And that might happen around the edges. I just think that'd be a very small portion. The biggest reason is because of the dollar denominated debt. A lot of people think we run on a petrodollar system, which means the dollar is only strong because it is backed by oil. I would argue oil is backed by the dollar because of all the dollar denominated debt in the world, which means all these countries are borrowing in dollars. Therefore, they have the need for dollars and they want to spend in dollars. And when you have that ginormous network effect, I think that the countries are going to be incentivized to continue that at least for as long as possible. I don't know when it's going to change, how it's going to change, and if it does change, if the free market will even choose to change. There is just too many cross factors that I am not smart enough, nor have the intellectual capacity to even think through.
Yeah. And here's the other dimension, too, that you've got to layer into all of this. It's the geopolitical intrigue. And here's what I mean by this. So we go back in time. They froze USTs that were owned by Russia, right? That's functionally what happened, right, in that regard. And if the rest of the world saw this, and then it seemed like they didn't do anything. And then I kind of wonder that one of the things I love to harp on people about absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I then think to myself, if you were managing a geopolitical game or whatever, right? You mentioned the free market, and the free market I think is an important way, and something can guide and suggest where many decisions are going to go. But do not underestimate the cross current of geopolitical shenanigans and intrigue, including the ability to overwhelm the free market. You and I've talked about that before. We don't need to go into it, this time in front. And so I think to myself, what if the various countries sat down, and when I say country, let's say, let's say the top 40 economies sat down and said, okay, look, this is ridiculous. The US really crossed the line, but here's the problem. Number one, if we start getting out of US treasuries right now, anything more than just like a token thing or whatever, right? We're going to look like the bad guy, and we're going to bring down the wrath of the US on us. So nonetheless, it's something that we want to do, but we have to strategically exit, or we have to strategically position our exit. That might be the first thing. The second thing might be this: we have to do so in a way where if one of us screws up, that person might get out, but it's going to sink the ship for the other, let's say 39 countries that are there. And the only way that we're going to get out of this, that is these 40 countries, these hypothetical countries I'm talking about, is we've got to do so in a very calm, orderly fashion. Because if we don't do that, it's just going to be absolute chaos, and the risk of that is probably worse than the risk of staying in for that situation. Hence why I go back to OPEC in the sense that I think you're 100% correct in that. I go back to my gift card analogy. Why on earth would an OPEC member want to trade a gift card, a treasury that could be used anywhere, for something that would be like less useful? Well, one reason for that might be is that if they feel suddenly the gift card issuer is going to snap their fingers and turn off the gift card. Okay, so that might be a reason for that. But then the question becomes, okay, well, if you're going to do that, how do you actually exit that without pissing off the entire system? And then what you might do in that situation is,
it wouldn't be just pissing off the system. It would be crushing its own economy. There is not a country in the world that I can think of right now that is not reliant upon the dollar for their banking system. If a sovereign told their country that they could no longer transact in dollars, they could not take out loans in dollars, what would that do to their country, who has been borrowing in dollars for the past 20, 30 years, that has all of this pent up dollar denominated debt on its balance sheet? That might be outside the sovereign, but that's in its country. Are you just telling them to default? What does that do to, that would be catastrophic.
What's with his, so if sovereign A, for whatever odd reason, said, okay, listen, we are going to dump 10% of our U.S. Treasuries, whatever, right? They're going to liquidate them into cash, and presumably they're going to turn them into dollars. See, this is where it gets really weird, or whatever, right? Okay, so now they've turned a UST into
Yeah, which
USD, and it's like, okay, well, now what? If anything, you've just strengthened the dollar, and you've strengthened the dollar, meaning that you've weakened your own currency. And as Josh, as you accurately note, well, guess what? All your dollars-denominated debts or whatever else you have to bring in that's denominated in dollars, like you're basically playing yourself in that situation. And then the second thing is that even if yields are up right now, why on earth would you sell at a loss? Do you see what I'm trying to say in this regard? Like, why? I mean, like, what would compel a sovereign?
if I was a sovereign and I wanted to de-dollarize, I would just stop buying treasuries and I would let my current debt mature. But that doesn't
Yeah.
fix the actual their economy from de-dollarizing. I don't think the sovereigns matter too much in the grand scheme of things if they are the ones de-dollarizing. I do
Dollar,
not
right? Yeah.
I do not think in the grand scheme of things, the sovereigns are the important individuals to look at, whether they are de-dollarizing or they are increasing their treasury position. I think the more important factor is what is happening to US dollar denominated debt outside the United States and in these countries, because
Yeah,
that is what is going to dictate the future demand for dollars to the highest degree and
but
what's going on in the economy.
Josh, again, you raise an excellent point, but never underestimate the power of the sovereign. Consider what happened in Hungary with the forint. This is
Oh,
so
I completely agree with you. And I think that we are heading toward this trend of de-dollarization at the fastest pace we have ever been. But at
what,
what pace is that? I mean, it's
well,
still
well, well, hold on. But before we get there, see, here's my point, though, right? Like, if you have the euro, or I blanking hate euro dollars today, I'm just going to call them, you have offshore dollars and offshore dollar debt that's floating around there, whatever, right? Nothing would stop a sovereign from coming in and saying, okay, let's say, Josh, give me a country, give me a large country you want me to pick on.
Turkey.
Turkey. Okay, Turkey all of a sudden says, okay, listen, Turkish citizens or whatever, right? You have debt denominated in euros and debt denominated in dollars and debt denominated in yen, maybe, or whatever, right? These are the new rules of the game. We, the sovereign, have issued a decree that this debt is immediately being denominated in Turkish lira. No ifs, no ands, no buts. Sovereigns have that capacity to do that. People might stomp their feet. People might say it's illegal. It doesn't matter. In times
What
of
will-
war, the law will fall
does that
silent.
do, what does that do to the dollar? That would make the dollar skyrocket because they're defaulting on their dollar denominated debt. And what does that do to the global economy? Because who do they owe those dollars to? It's going to be a bank in either Turkey or London or China or one of these banks that are lending them the dollars that could be outside of Turkey. And then they're on the hook for it. And then what's going on? I mean, that would cause so much mayhem. It would be like Armageddon style chaos that it would be going on.
But would it be Armageddon style chaos in Turkey or outside Turkey? See, this is where you get into.
It would be outside of Turkey, and that's what I'm talking about. It would also be
Well,
probably the banking system inside of Turkey, but
well, hold on. But let's do one thing at a time. Let's say let's say you're Erdogan or whatever, right? You've just won re-election and you now have to deliver goods, on the thing or whatever, right? Who cares if some bank in the city gets screwed over? Who cares if there's some Japanese multinational or whatever, right, that has to do a massive right on their balance sheet? From the perspective of your citizens, who you answer. See, here's the thing, right? Your boss, in a sense, of the politician, are the voting people in your constituency
yeah,
or whatever,
well,
right?
I mean, I agree with you. That could happen, but that would cause a ton of pain for Turkey down the line. But politicians don't think about that.
Yeah.
For example, if hypothetically Turkey did decide to say that and they wiped out all of the debt and they made it all through Turkish lira, then what actually happens to the Turkey economy in the future? How does an economy grow? Through bank lending and funding new businesses to start. That would virtually go away under that circumstance. And
But again,
that
Josh, well, hold on. But before we get to there, let's also consider the case of Argentina. How many times has Argentina defaulted, whether soft or hard on their debt? Yet Argentina is still able to
what's
borrow.
happened in Argentina.
But here's my point, though. Like, what's happening again is, yeah, sure, it blows up, but guess what? They get over it. People still loan them money, and then they blow up all over again.
Mhm.
And so, like, I don't mean to see, this is the problem when you try to bring in the geopolitics to all of this. Like, it turns over the table, and you can have the most in-depth economic models that deal with all these things. You can understand all the nuances or whatever, right? But all you need is geopol to come in and basically just change the rules of the game. And when you change one thing up there, you get this cascading effect that goes down. So my point from all of this is that getting back to OPEC, this is what I could see happening from OPEC. And I say this from a geopolitical angle, not necessarily like a free market angle, is you might have the OPEC players that say, okay, look, we really need to have an alternative besides the dollar. We've got to develop this alternative. And the US itself might even want us to have an alternative besides the dollar. Or there might be an argument to an extent that the US would even be interested in seeing where this goes, right? But we have to do it very strategically. And it's one of those things where like everything has to come online at once. And so maybe the way that we kind of do testing in this regard, or like maybe one of the ways that they could develop like a true like multinational exchange that's ultimately backed by commodities, you start with something that everybody understands: oil. Use an institution that kind of is already in the center of the oil exchange, OPEC. And you say, like, listen, here's what's going on, right? We're still using dollars again for like 98% of settlement. Just to be clear, right? That dollar ain't going anywhere or whatever, right? But just out of an abundance of caution, blah, 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 whatever. This is where you start engaging the diplomacy and the geopolitical intrigue. We're also going to start with a theoretical sample, let's say like 1 or 2% settlement system and something, outside the dollar, just to see where it goes. And when you do this, you can start developing, the real, or you start getting data on real world implications of how an alternative system would work. You can see the financial flows, or you can see the liquidity, or would assume you could see the liquidity flows through the system. And I see this as being the first, crack to opening the door to actually going to a material system, or a system that can hold much more than, let's say, 1 or 2% of settlement for OPEC. And if you do your homework on that, then you might be able to expand it onwards and upwards to other things too. And that, I would argue, that might be in the interest of the sovereigns to compel them to say, okay, well, listen, let's just kind of see where this goes. And perhaps even from the standpoint of the United States, that might be in some interest there might be an argument there that it's also in the United States' best interest, at least to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, this is just game theory. I think the probability of this happening is incredibly low over the next few months to years, but the trend is in motion and these shifts will happen. So thinking through for the future is never a bad thing. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.